Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I really am so happy that you are all here, and I'm especially happy that all these people are here, because here we have something very peculiar and interesting, that people from 4 different projects that were funded in the funding programs Media Art Fund and Media Art Fellowship will talk about their views and their practices. And I'm so glad that I'm nearly speechless, but I'm not. I try not to be. My name is Klaas Werner. I'm the Deputy Director of the Medienwerk NRW, and you all know, because you are here, that this is part of the month of Media Art, peer-to-peer festival that is traveling from Düsseldorf via Cologne, Havixbeck to Essen in this month. 5 weekends full of talks, performances, showings from projects that were funded in these already named funding programs by the Ministry of Arts and Culture, Culture and Science, of North Rhine-Westphalia. And I will not talk about what you will hear, because you will hear it, but I want to very briefly introduce our moderator of this session, which is Christian Sievers. And I'm very happy that Christian is here, because Christian deals with the ever-changing aspects between the artwork and the audience on the background of digitalization, and his artistic work tries to think about participation and how to rethink about the structure of participation. And Christian has been a friend of the network Medienwerk NRW for a very long time. We've worked together several times, which also has to do with his several positions that he had here at KHM, Kunsthochschule für Medien, Köln. From 2011 to 2022, he was working as a wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter. I always don't know the English word for that, maybe there is none. Together with, and you were having the control space seminar together with Julia Scher, dealing with surveillance architectures, and you were also from 2018 to 2020 the Rector for Lehre and Studium, and since 2020 you are the head of project on a very, very interesting digitalization and archival project, which is called Medienkunst NRW, which is also why we are so glad that you will moderate this session, because you've been dealing with archives and memories for some time now on a professional level. And I will hand over to you now, and thank you for being here.
I think you need to turn this on.
This one's on?
Yes.
It's also on.
It's okay, louder, but I think it's probably okay, right? But hey, thank you, Klaas, for welcoming me, and hello. I want also to say hi and welcome, and thanks for coming. It's a real honor, and I'm really excited. So today's talk in English: free archival practices and institutional archives. And some of you I've met, some I have not, or some I have just met. We agreed not to have long presentations, but instead everybody introduces themselves just for a few minutes, and then we'll kick it off. So I had the privilege of being introduced. You have to do it yourself. I'm sorry, but we're trying to have a conversation rather than the boring academic format where everybody presents and then there's no conversation. So thank you.
Thanks. My name is Agustina Andreoletti. I'm here because I'm the project lead of Liquid Archive. That's a project initiated at the Roundtable Museum, the museum with many colonial connections in Cologne. And the project's idea is to have different types of accessibility and to democratize the collections on and create a project that's intersectional. So like, what does it mean in this context? It's creating like different formats where people can have access to the database, can have access to the depot. I just came from a depot guided tour. So also work with teenagers. So we have from fellowships from fellows from the Global South to a seminar we led together. Maybe that's the segue.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hopkins, and I am a former colleague of Christian. We were artist researchers, I think, künstlerisch-wissenschaftliche Mitarbeiter. There's some feedback. Thanks. And together with Agustina, we've been running a seminar for students connected with the League project. And the exhibition is currently on show in the Kunsthochschule Museum for another month. And in my own practice, I'm interested in also questions of access, working with museum collections, often but not exclusively collections which have been put together in the colonial period. And I grew up I have family still living in and continue to work in Nairobi, so part of my practice is rooted there and part of my practice is rooted here. Thank you.
My name is Mirjam Schmuck. I'm artistic director of the performance collective Köln Collective, and perhaps I only say a few sentences about the project and not about myself. We did a project called Cassia. It was that I wanted to work about the first female composer we know in Europe, and she lived in Constantinople and founded a monastery for women, so a kind of a female empowerment space. And I wanted to do an opera, and I only found notes about this female figure in the internet, a few sentences in Wikipedia and few in the Gender Museum in Istanbul. And during this research of 3 years of this project, I met so many people and worked with activists from Turkey, from Poland, and so on, that the huge question was, what is normally not a big question in the performing arts, perhaps it's coming now, but do we want to archive something, what we collect as knowledge in this time? And out of this really huge connection project about Cassia, where over 150 people all over the world were part of, we developed an archive called Cassia, a performative archive, where we tried to make accessible what is like a huge research project in the performing arts scenes, and to try to bring all the knowledge and the artistic approaches and the work of the activists from different countries together. Yeah, and it was really together with Mirevi. It's based in Düsseldorf. Experts from mixed reality and visualization, and Sputnik collective in Krefeld, to make an archive for this female role model of feminism and composer and writer, and to bring a contemporary monastery into the digital world. This was the tryout.
My name is Wouter. I'm a research fellow for the Intermedia Art Institute in Düsseldorf, specifically for the project the Cassette Underground, for which I lived for a few months in Düsseldorf last year. It's mainly a research project about the circulation and distribution of cassette music in North Rhine-Westphalia, because the cassette was sort of enabled the DIY mindset and allowed everybody to record and distribute music as they wish themselves. So that, yeah, we looked at how these cassettes spread through the area, and the different users and groups of people that use the cassette for different ends as a means. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kiran Kumār. My background is in both dance and media art, I suppose. And because they kind of happened back to back or together. For me, I've from the beginning always been interested in the question of archiving dance or documenting dance for a bunch of various reasons. One being that the dance that I practice is somewhat of a discontinuous tradition. So part of the pedagogy was to be able to access an archive and understand what is missing or what is, how it's been reconstructed. So it was, I would say at first it was a pedagogical tool. And then, but this continued for a while, of course, that I also did it at a time when the very first experiments were already always digital. So, and that kind of continues in my project with the fellowship is also around the question of rethinking what dance document might be. This time more specifically with informed by concepts of the body that come out of yoga and tantra in general. And it's, I suppose in a way, it's also to kind of ask the question in maybe two ways. That is, so of course the dance that I first refer to, I think one of the caveats is that it's, I don't think of it actually as a dance, it's actually a ritual performance, which kind of is framed as a dance. So the question of how we can archive a ritual of course exists, but equally I feel that the question also needs to be inverted and ask how we can ritualize archiving practices so that one doesn't become the verb and the other the noun, and kind of have a reversal of agency.
Okay, thank you. Just to give a bit of context about my current work and why I'm here. So for the last 10 months, I've been project lead of a small part of a small team that is conceiving an entirely new archive that is called Medienkunst.nrw. And it's a rather unprecedented project because it's trying to secure and describe and also where possible give access to all the multimedia holdings and collections of the art and music academies of NRW. So that's 5 of them. 3 music academies, there's KM, which is art and film, and then there's Folkwang, which is also doing dance and theater and design and photography on top. So we have to somehow integrate all those various genres. And KM is the only one that actually has an archive already. So from KM we will try to ingest about 5,500 student projects from the last 30 years. So once we have all those historical and the other academies, they have collections. You know, they have institutes. They have sort of structured collections. Some people have a hard drive somewhere, right? So we try to, you know, secure that and give access to it because at the moment there's no access. And once that's all ingested, we will be at about 300, 400 terabytes. And every year we get the new student projects, it will be another 30, 40 terabytes. And it's not a problem because we're using state infrastructure to store all that. And there's another state agency that takes it and just does the deep storage for us. And they do the sort of technical details, making sure the data carrier doesn't degrade, nothing gets lost to bit rot, and you know, they're copied over to a new format every 5 years and so on. So it's basically lasting forever. We're making sure everything lasts forever as possible. And when we have the budget, well, we still have it right now anyway, and we have the sort of state support. So I could say in this round, I'm firmly the part of the institutional archive compared to the free archival practices, you know. And the introduction asked, where does those two overlap? And I'm not sure they do, actually. I can't say. I'd be curious to find out, you know. I have this double function that I completely understand the need for these, you know, individual archives, grassroots archives, you know, small political archives that are not bound to an institution. But where those two, I don't think it can be solved anyway. But I really believe in giving access and making things, you know, accessible for artistic reasons, for political reasons, you know, for democracy, right? And also, I think because we have a discussion we want to do, I start with a small question, right? And by definition, an archive is the place where the stuff goes that is not needed anymore. That's really where an archive is. This is where the dry stuff goes, basically. You may need it again, but not for the current operations of whatever it is that you're archiving. So, and one way or the other, you're all not doing that. You're working with archives in other ways. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about why from the beginning. As an introduction. And anyone, we will take it from there.
It was interesting that you said secure and give access. Can they exist together? Like this security, things like if you give access, there is certain risk in giving access. And I understand it was more about the data, but I'm like in our project, or like, I'm not building an archive. The archive is there. So there is 65,000 objects and 100,000 photographs. And I'm trying to be like, and it's secure. And it's too secure. And the security, and there's so many security lines of like going to the depot today, the security, I didn't know because I wasn't in the group, the security person was like, don't touch anything, you're not welcome here, kind of vibe. Or said that, actually, not the vibe only. So I work not only going to the depot, but like with the digital database. And the digital database, it's not so much regulated. And that's where I found the loopholes about sharing things. And about like duplicating. And about like this, like your work is to centralizing, creating one database. My work is to multiply and sharing, people be able to download them and create like non-coherent storytelling.
Yep.
Does anyone else want to?
I do have. I find this description of the archive as something that you don't use. Provocative, but also a bit productive, at least coming from the perspective of not just dance, but I would add to it a somatic approach to dance and a somatic practice. That is, there is, like as with the institution, with the body, also a large part of knowledge and knowing that is left latent, which is necessarily so. That is, it is not, in fact, what Antonio was describing is also that the kind of processes that are active are the ones that are perhaps more intellectualized or enacted every day. And we're talking about things that remain latent so that they can just surface at some point. And I'm thinking, for example, maybe a good, not always a good reference is, you see this in the military, that a lot of training is basically rehearsing movement patterns, so that at the moment of fight or flight, you are falling back on something that is already known or a habit. And this is a huge capacity of the body, that you function like an iceberg, that most of what is cognitive activity is really like above the surface, and it's a certain percentage, but you fall back or you fall down to your basic habits. And I think that's something to be said about also this mirroring this capacity, so that the unused is not only useless, but as it is. And also just I think of it, for me, one way of stimulus or one motivation to work with archives is also a way to connect and work actively with ancestry and ancestors. That this is just a kind of intellectual garb to talk about deeper time and deeper ways of living through. And this not using, I think, is also, especially when we have certain cultures of where using is violent and comes with its disallowances, it's not bad to go unused for a few generations.
Let things rest.
Yeah, it's perhaps more.
I'm not at all an expert on archives, I need to say, as a performing artist. But in the research of how we can change a kind of narration, I think it's getting more important who's collecting and who decides how to collect and how to make things visible. Perhaps they are not important yet, but perhaps later. And I also know countries where no archive is existing. For example, when we work with performers from Cameroon, and there's really only one place where you can go to know something. The rest is burned. It's not existing anymore. And so I have the feeling that it's more important to make in a way accessible also the things which are fluid, which are not in a normal archive, which are not like where you can save them. And this, I think, was the tryout we wanted to have to ask with feminist practices, how we can think about an archive, how does it look like. And it was only a first very basic research, because there was this one funding, and now this funding is already done and it's not existing anymore. So perhaps there is no interest in this kind of collaborations or thinking this differently. But this was the huge question, and also to answer on a figure like Cassia, where you have the researchers, but you have no archive on this figure. She wasn't interesting at all, and why this narration wasn't interesting and still not interest, why there is no interest, and then how to answer. Is it about, again, to try to or I don't want to ask only people who studied history or are experts on the Byzantine times, but also contemporary composers and perhaps figures who could feel like this world of Cassia could open up something. And so I think it was also not about being correct in this archive. It's also more like that you can get lost in there, and that you don't need to know what to type into the search function to go somewhere. That it's a different way of thinking, how to share knowledge and how to make it accessible. And so I would say it's really was more an idea how to rethink, how to bring ideas and energies together, and not to have this classical idea of an archive, but what would be needed if we rethink this idea of because it's really double-bind, this archive, because if we work against representation, an archive in the end is still there. So the work is gone, but I leave traces, and I need to be very careful, because I don't want to represent against something or to have a hierarchy in there. So. But in the same moment, it was for us important to say, at the moment, it's really important to bring a figure like this and the discussion to lead the Istanbul Convention in Turkey and so on together, and to make different connections. So I think in the archive, how to meet material objects and knowledge needs more to make a different kind of connections than I would expect, perhaps if I go in a classical archive where I have a register and I know what to search for.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be like a traditional institutionalized archive to have value as an archive, right? So for this cassette world that we dove into, it was a largely undocumented world in the first place, and so we traveled to traditional archives around the area, but we just as much met up with people who were actually active back in the days, who still had like large catalogs at home of all the things that they've gathered and throughout the years, and that can have just as much value from somebody who had been active actually in the thing you're researching as something that is institutionalized inside a traditional archive, I feel.
Maybe just to add to that, I think it's really interesting to see, like the archive that we've been working in is a kind of a traditional archive, in the sense that it's a centralized, organized, massive database, and it feels like the projects which you're working on are kind of trying to establish collections of things which are not previously like in one place or documented. Yeah. And so kind of seeing those things alongside one another is kind of quite interesting, because to see there's a shared sense of creating access to that cultural production.
Yeah.
for people that previously couldn't do it. And you know, that's like, as Christian said, access is about politics, it's about how you feel, it's like kind of social thing, it's about democracy, it's various things. But something I've been also wondering about just personally is like, I have a feeling that the sort of work as an artist, how disposable the projects I do are. Like, if you've been making art for a few years, like 10 years, 15 years, you kind of keep on making, then you realize that no one really gives a shit what you made a few years ago. And no one, you know, including yourself. And I wonder if that's somehow, like, certainly for me, I have the feeling that subconsciously that's really affecting my kind of, let's say, professional position towards like these archives, the sense that I don't know how fast things move at the moment.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something that resonates with any of you as practitioners.
Well, would you create differently, like in an artistic sense, if you knew that the eventual work would end up in an archive? Like, does it influence the process of creation?
I have to think about it.
Maybe I can say something, and maybe go to the next question. But those are really good points. And I wrote down latent knowledge. You know, the knowledge that's sort of there but not visible, and archive the things that are fluid but still need preserving, or you know, so they're still accessible. You know, you don't need it every day, but you need to be able to pull it. You know, or it's a question of writing history, of being able to, at least. You know, if it's gone, it's gone. And then the last question was, you know, what does the work end up differently if you know that it's going to end up in art? Yes, I think so. Clearly, because and this is the knowing, also as a practitioner making work, like if you, and I think it's not possible to reconcile the two. You know, if you the desire to and we talked about this briefly the other day, the desire to preserve something, right? To make sure it's not lost by accident or by time, or you know, and the, you know, like an artwork, like a living thing basically, right? It changes. It can always take on new forms. But the moment you archive it, it's effectively killing it also. You know, somebody yesterday said, it was Nashi, he said that museums are graveyards. I really agree, you know, that's also the function of a museum in a way, traditionally. And and this desire to keep the work, but also by killing it, it's not something we can solve, I think, easily, you know. I mean, you mentioned a possible way by saying, let's turn it was what I understood anyway, you know, to turn the act of archiving into a ritual or into the work, you know. And let me know when you manage to do that, you know. I'd be curious, but just to explain, you know, the moment you take in work, put it in an archive, you have to describe it, you have to sort of give some context, you have to give it categories so it can later be found, right? You put it in this archive on that, or you give it some hashtags, or you know, and that's the core idea of an archive, to make things accessible. But by doing that, you distance yourself from it, and you declare something that's distinct and closed in itself, usually. You know, and, well, you know, I'd be curious if it has to be that way. And there's lots of stories I could tell, but I think we have great questions. So maybe I can just ask you. You know, you said this. You know, you archive ritual performances. They can be called dance, right? But also the act of archiving could become a ritual. Can you say more about that?
There's something I maybe collectively respond to quite a few of even the observation that Sam made. I do not necessarily think these two movements, for example, the case with the cassette tapes is slightly temporarily different, but with what Mirjam is doing, for example, is that yes, these are two, let's say, constructive approaches, and what you are doing is a bit more deconstructive of something that is already there. But I see a kind of an alliedness in it, in that we are basically working on two directions to loosen a system that we find somewhat hegemonic. And they work on different planes, that the deconstruction is happening at a social, cultural level. But the construction is happening, I think, necessarily at a kind of a cosmological level. Because it's these cosmologies that are really being lost when you talk about accessing pre-modern knowledges. Like things that are out of this particular time, and that's why I leave the cassette tapes out, because they belong to a certain technological milieu. And on the question of then where ritualizing, and I also have to, there's so many caveats about this word and how it enters also from ecology. At first it's used to describe bees, and then it's used to describe ethnographically others, for certain. So there's a lot of that, but I maybe just connect it back to a practice that maybe we're a little more familiar with. There's now that yoga is some kind of an urban phenomenon, and that you will see most urban classes will end with the corpse, right? So you have an hour's or 90-minute session that kind of leaves you in a relaxed, and it's called the Shavasana or the corpse pose, and that there is this non-allergicness to death, and that death is something that you can rehearse and access daily, as if, I would say, like within the practice you are ritualizing that moment of death, and then you wake up and re-enter the world renewed, alive, and all of that. And at the same time, like when we have to then critique it, it is, I guess for me, Ivan Illich comes to mind. He's this thinker from, I guess he's Canada, and already in the 70s he wrote books called The Medical Nemesis, where he was talking about, which resurfaced during Corona, which was interesting, that we are losing our capacity to die as a civilization because of medical technology kind of constantly pushing towards increasing mortality. And so this are very just the psychogeography of what the space of death is, whether it's a space of potency, or is it that complete unknown that I have a rigor mortis, like a morbid reaction to, is a question. And perhaps we're talking about knowledge systems where this is not necessarily a no-go. So there are these cyclicities of knowing and unknowing, and like with hibernation, and you don't think the plant is dead, like the chili plant, as you prepare it for the winter, it will come back in the spring. So it's not that it is dead, and why must us, and it is a kind of a hyper-individuation, that we're focusing all our attention of knowledge production on a first name, last name, like the idea of the individual. Whereas if you think of it more as a community, as a collective, as a tradition and ancestry, then there is a sense of, I guess a different, the labor is different, and also your sense of your role and your belonging is different. So that's what that's the ritual for me. It's not, again, that I do have a bit of a critique with, especially with the trope of performance art. When we say the word ritual, there's something immediately performative that comes up. But I think that's just one, that's again a socio-cultural way of looking at ritual. There are other things happening in ritual, and we are kind of missing that, especially with the body and which body is active when you're performing a ritual. It's often this thing, at least like in my research and what we share later today, we actively, like with the digital, I think there's a huge potential, because I think even just 3 or 4 years ago, the media theorist Yu Hui started talking about this idea of cosmotechnics, which is a huge kind of, for me at least, it was an opportunity, because for a long time philosophy has not been dealing with these kind of other knowledges. And I'm sorry to maybe go on like this, but what also happened was right in 2018, the Dalai Lama came out with something he was asked in one other interview, that we've been, quantum physics and Buddhism have been in conversation for 30 years now, how does it feel? And he's like, what conversation? physics has not been talking about reincarnation, and that is a central tenet of Buddhism. So I don't see it as a conversation because there is no repetition. Unless with the digital, then you can talk about recursivity, loops, and this idea of repetition, which is not the same thing, but so there's something somewhat of a long gap, I think. And that's why I see a lot of potential with the digital, because at least there is this new horizon of conversations that are slightly happening differently.
Thank you.
Sorry for the rant.
No, it's a lot to take in, but I'll look at the recording later. But really interesting too. When I said, you were effectively killing the work, and it's not necessarily a problem. That's excellent way to look at it. Also it also makes it manageable. You can go on. It's luggage you don't have to carry anymore. And I think, especially in the West, and working with technology, you're sort of primed to always go for the forever archive. And literally, if you look at Silicon Valley, they believe they will live forever by uploading. So that's an archive. Also, probably in their eyes. So thank you for turning that around. Anybody else wants to answer to that?
I won't answer, but maybe we'll just carry on.
Yeah, please.
Because it's extremely inspiring. Thank you. I think what you're just saying now made me start to think more and more about this idea that archive is a repository, which is this kind of classical Western idea, a repository of knowledge, a repository of things, and I guess there's apart from the fact there's the observation that not like who has access to that has been limited. It's also we were just discussing with class the idea that there's something really almost perverse about trying to stop any kind of decay, stop time, and stop change with the things that move into this archive. And I guess one of the things I'm interested in, maybe we're interested in, is activating that, and who gets to activate that. So not only who gets to activate it, but activating it at all. And I think one of the ways in which then we have continuity between our different practices is the way that knowledge then becomes activated through practice and through people doing things. And then that's a way that the archive then leaks out. It's not just a file, it's a practice, it's a thing which is done.
I think it's also, you mentioned repository, I think it's also could be useful to introduce terms from like professional archival context, where you have a museum which is different. Museum gives context, it explains what it holds.
Sorry, I'm in museum here. I'm not.
No, isn't that the idea?
That's the idea. But have you seen the database? No, there is no information.
But this stuff that's on display.
Yeah, but it's less than 2%.
Because it's so much work. Right?
Yes.
There's no space.
There is no space, but there is also not woman power on research to machen. To do research, sorry, I was studying German before.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that the institutional archive has the knowledge, an objective knowledge, and the archive has it's a very touch different, it's like every culture is archived the same. No, they're I think 2,000 masks from Sri Lanka because there was someone there who was very interested in masks from Sri Lanka. And I was thinking during our conversation, because like now here is like this role from museum, but actually my research before was on pirate libraries and how like these, like for example, you have ARG, like there's a pirate library that is also, you can request what can be digitalized. And you have the library, the official library, so you have the institution, the museum, the library, and you have this underground way of creating archive that's like on-demand sharing. And access there is actually non-coherent, because if you check the hashtags, the categorization, that's like, it's not coherent, but actually in this non-coherence, you can find things because you don't know how the archive speaks, or how the person who decide on like the Getty categorization system, or the wiki, or like that's one person who decided that. The other creates like agency not being coherent. So, yeah. Sorry for interrupting you, like the museum, no.
I was glad you did.
Yeah, but I think it's an important point only to have one example, because I was now for over 1 year in Athens. There is this Academia Platonos, so it's the old Academy of Platon. And these are only old stones into a park. You have there a community living there, using this park with these old stones, and there is a super small museum from people living there, and there is a free university in summer, organized by the people there internationally. And now the city wants to make a museum there, a huge one, where you can go then over glass and see the stones under it with informations, and it will be curated about what is said about this old Academia of Platon. And they will destroy every knowledge what is there, what is kind of an archive of the people living there, what they built it there. And then if they will build up a museum, it will be for tourists. So I think this colonial gesture you have in tourism, in these museums, for example, of this knowledge, goes on. And I think this kind of perhaps anti-archive or whatever I would be interested in is something completely else. Perhaps I don't know the terms, and perhaps the classical terms of archive doesn't fit there, but I think this idea in this movement of something what is not in a classical archive and what will be more also like a contemporary statement. So perhaps it's not so important in 10 years or 15 years, but the archive at the moment shows up what's going on in this time, and it's not as a form of representation and to make something living forever. I think this is important perhaps, but we need to have self-destroying archives or whatever, that they have only a little time so that you can see when they were built or what is happening. So I think you have to include all these questions when you make knowledge or something accessible. And all these problems, I would say, are not yet in museums, not yet included in all these discussions. And so the question would be how to make in this park in Academia Platonos, which is super alive, how to archive this situation there at the moment, and not to make again a museum with glass and with information walls, whatever. But it would make sense to archive the knowledge which is there now, and this alive place, and the stones where the children are allowed to climb on, not like an Acropolis where it's forbidden to touch the old stones. And I think this is a very important question, how to rethink perhaps the idea of an archive. It's only an example, and I know perhaps it's not so, but perhaps it explains a bit why I'm interested in or I think perhaps that also artists have an important view on this, because we work every day we do a movement and perhaps it's gone. And perhaps we will never create it again in the next rehearsal. Perhaps it's not there anymore. But yeah, so this is why I'm interested in this question.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree. But can I just quiz you now? If you wanted to know something from this body of knowledge that's in this place and these people, how would you request something? Can you go and find out? Or can you, how does it work?
I mean, there is a very small museum, and there, for example, you have a television where you have interviews with the people living there. And this is something what could change over the years, for example, so where you have to reactivate this archive of voices, of faces who are living there. And I think I don't have any solution, but I think that we have to listen more to the places and to the people before we put it into a structure like institutions are thinking that it's still working, because the institution is there to represent something, and they have power. And I think that for example a city like Athens is not interested in not tourism, so there is no other solution. But this upgrading of these places is a real problem, to give them money and to build up something. I think it's there is no solution, but to combine perhaps the old stones with the living people would be important, and not only to save all these old stones, that nobody touched them, that you can make another nice pictures in 100 of years from them. This would be important.
And the situation is extra sort of problematic if there's only one object of it, right? For example, the Acropolis or any other old structure in Athens. If you have an archive of, let's say, that holds books or music, and there are multiple copies of it, so you can save one without losing the value of the others. If you have a structure like Acropolis, I mean, there's only one Acropolis. If you becomes a bit like a wild animal that you put in a cage in a zoo, right? And if there's only one of it, and you just put a fence behind it, and you can look at it, but that's about it. It's different than if there are multiple versions of that, for example, books or any carrier of intellectual property.
Yeah, but that's also one of the things I think to keep, I feel reminding myself as an artist, as a contemporary artist working in this region and in the context, is that the colonial archive is exactly because of this technological issue, it's standing at some kind of a threshold, between some milieu where knowledge is reproducible and one that is not. And there I want to be a little bit careful about saying let's destroy the archive or it's not important. Because, I mean, this is also, I think it's a very right moment to do these things. After 2018, when Ferlin Sarr and Benedict Savoy came out with the report on the restitution of African cultural artifacts, I think it was very important that an economist was one of the co-author, and that it made, of course, this, in Critique of Finance, we've been talking about it, that poverty is a financial instrument, that it is a constructed entity and it is not something that is natural. Nobody is naturally poor because resources are available, especially those parts of the world that were colonized are also from the tropics, and they're generally rich in resources. And so there's the very idea of to come around why there is an economic deficit there is kind of because it is a complex construct of the legacy of colonialism, industrialization, capitalism, and all of these things. And somehow the economic argument makes it visible because there are traces and there is imbalances. But the archive, I think, also becomes this double set. Of course, like with the colonial collection, yes, there is that question of when tourism happens and where are the resources going, who's benefiting from what. But equally, there is, I feel like, the absences of the invisibility of what we can perhaps start calling epistemic reparations. That is the loss of knowledge, the loss of ways of knowing that are then somewhat sitting silently and latently in these objects and things, just because they are waiting to be done something with, that they need to be ritualized by way of acting and doing something. And of course the Buddhist mandala comes to mind, where it's a very large, elaborate drawing, and then immediately when it's finished, the very gesture is to erase it. So that kind of an erasure where the activation embodies the knowledge, not just a kind of a hasty guilt trip kind of a burning or closure just because let's get it done away with. Because there's a project to be done after the economic reparations or not. We can still talk about what the role of the university, role of the knowledge institution is in epistemic reparations, and how we can construct these kind of, I think this loophole, part of the leakiness sounds is also the fellowships where you can invite people through these institutional structures, and those are important because that needs to be done, and that's labor left to be. And so as these cycles and things finish, we always, I think that's the creative task of how to keep it going and how to keep the knowledge work.
I looked at the clock and we have 5 minutes left. Great. And oh, sorry, I was just talking to this. I think I find it impossible to wrap it up because clearly we end up with more questions than answers. But like you said, questions alone are not enough. You have to actually get out there and take a risk and do something. And I would subscribe to that. And maybe one more quick question that I really wanted to know, a personal interest also. This has to do again with access and this idea that making art is a communicative act, right? Anybody who's the receiver, the audience of an artwork, sees it's an artwork by assuming there's some kind of something meant as a communication is intended, and also on the other side, the artist will only declare something an artwork if it has some kind of audience in mind, right? And so this is I think it's really important to when making art to consider the audience. What is it you want from them, basically. So the question really here is, archives as artworks, but who is your audience, and what should they do with it? And that really I'd like to hear.
Actually, that was a problem for the project, where I don't want one audience. There are different audiences, and for that there is the possibility of creating different formats. And the universal archive, the universal museum, one story that only targets one group. So I was wondering, if we were thinking about digital archives, which is more like what I'm working on, that's why I like the idea of Git, of forking, of okay, there is one center, but then there is the possibility of copying and creating this new version that's connecting to the core. Sometimes you can track back where that comes from, and you can be incoherent but at the same time traceable. And that allows even that was the idea of this forking, or this kind of inviting people with different languages to enter the archive. And then through that invitation, this feeling of being invited can move around and can find other projects or other ways of relating to the archive, but not just one language. And that's, I think, the issue with the archive in the museum, the label, just one label. It's just one text next to your work, and that's for one public.
I also find the idea of one audience difficult, but maybe, and this is kind of an indirect way of answering the question. And before working with Agustina on the Leaky Archive project, I was working on another project connected with the museum, in which we were building a database of Kenyan objects which are no longer in Kenya. So writing to different museums and asking them if they could share their database entries with us, because as someone in Kenya, there's no centralized information about where all the Kenyan objects are. And through that process, we basically found that there are, in many collections in Germany, it's very common to have what's called an ndome. It's a dance shield from the Kikuyu community. And in the whole of Kenya, there's one in the museum. And most museums have one. There's one in the Archbishop here. And now there's a renewed interest in initiation ceremonies and various different ceremonies associated with growing up amongst the Kikuyu community. And these communities want to know how to make this shield. And first of all, the shield, when it arrived, for example, in the Roundtable, here, because it was a shield, it was placed in the warfare section, but it's never used in the warfare because it's a ceremonial shield. I mean, you look at it, it's obviously not going to defend you from anything, but it's a shield, so it got put in the warfare section. So that's just in terms of like how things are misunderstood when they get here. And second, so basically, just to kind of get back to this idea of activating and using, and epistemic loss, like there's a knowledge which is contained in that thing about which can give clues to people for how to remake that thing, which you can only find if you hold that thing, then you use that thing. So that doesn't really answer your question, which is kind of like give some illustrations of how these things need to be used. You know.
I think this archive on Cassia was at first really, the audience were the participants, the 150 people who worked on this archive at first. Because I think one problem would be how to use it if you were not part of it, because this was more like an invitation to have your own access to this figure and to show who you are. So if you are a musician answering, if you are a student making a graphic or write something, people who went to Istanbul to make films. So it was really about, it was the same, I would say, in this archive. And this, I think, would be a great idea that participants and audience would be the same for generating archives.
The first thing that came to mind was, if we're talking about an audience for which you create something, was one of the groups that we looked at, which was like this grassroots, homegrown network of DIY musicians who created music at home through cassette, and which they operated largely outside of mainstream media channels and just the whole apparatus, I'd say, and they wrote contact addresses on the cassettes so as to send them around. And then the music became a tool was basically a trade. So somebody sent a cassette of their music in order to get something back. It was more like an exchange between artists than sort of the traditional artist-audience relation, I'd say. It's maybe a different purpose in creating, but just the sense of sharing is, cool.
I think for me the question of audience has been a kind of a problematic one. And I would say the short answer is I don't know who really the audience for my work is, and I say that also because for the last 6 years, from 2016 onward, I've been in a series of a project of writing letters to dead ancestors. So I really think I'm working with my ancestors, and there's nobody. Those are the people I'm directly addressing. And every time I do some kind of a reading or performance, I take a breath and tell myself, this is voyeurism. This is just somebody's letter coming into your inbox, like your mailbox, and then you open it and reading it. So that's kind of been my relationship with it. But I think slowly this, because it's also a cumulative thing, there is a sense of I can feel something shifting, but I can't answer who really the audience is.
I'd like to just end on that, if you allow. I like it a lot, all your answers, and I took a lot of notes. I hope I can read them later. But thank you so much, and I think a few of you will see tonight, so I'm looking forward to that. And thank you for following us. Thank you.